Hello, and welcome to the Global Pulse, where we speak with thinkers, diplomats, and changemakers, shaping the future of our world. I'm your host, Sid Chandra. Today, we're honored to be joined by one of the Pacific's most respected and insightful voices, Dr. Tess Newton Cain. Dr. Newton Cain is a principal consultant at Sustainio and a leading expert on politics, governance, and development across the Pacific region. Her work spans climate diplomacy, strategic communications, and Pacific-led storytelling, including the Sean Dorney Journalism Grant and advising institutions like UNESCAP and the Whitlam Institute. Dr. Newton Cain, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sid. Vanaka Vakalevu.
Thank you. So let's start big. So, what's the biggest misconception you think Australians or the international community have about the Pacific?
I think it largely comes from this belief that the Pacific, it's kind of like a double-edged thing. So one is that the Pacific is very small and insignificant, whereas as we know, the Pacific island countries have sovereignty over a vast swathe of the Earth's surface. So small countries or countries with small land masses, such as Kiribati, have EEZs that are bigger than India. So they are, they command and they have sovereignty over vast amounts of the ocean, the Earth's surface, and that means that they have sovereignty over significant amounts of resources. So often you will hear Pacific leaders say, we are large ocean states or big ocean states. Whereas often, when you read from the international media, the most common descriptor of an island country is often tiny. So you'll hear tiny Tuvalu or tiny Niue. Now, some of these countries are very small, but others of them are big. Papua New Guinea is a big country. It's a big landmass with a large population. And I think kind of tied to that is this lack of awareness. I don't want to say lack of interest. Sometimes it's a lack of interest. Largely, I just think it's a lack of awareness of the diversity of the region. So, people will sometimes say to me, oh, what do they think about what do they think about this in the Pacific? And it's like, well, I don't know what the answer to that question is, because how different things, whether it's trade, whether it's climate change, whether it's labor mobility, whether it's aid and development, all of these things play out differently depending on where in the region you are. These are very diverse countries. They have diverse histories, very diverse cultures, linguistically very diverse, as you probably know. In Papua New Guinea, there are more than 800 languages.
Yes.
And they're diverse political systems, diverse economies. And so I think in order for Australia and Australians to really understand their neighborhood, they really need to get to grips with this. Some people find it a bit daunting. I encourage students and others to embrace it. I say, this is what makes the Pacific such a fascinating part of the world to engage with, because there's always something new. Sometimes the diversity is even within a country. So, as we know, things play very differently in the highlands of Papua New Guinea than they do in the coastal regions. In a lot of countries, you might have, in the smaller countries like Vanuatu, example, there might be one or two significant urban centres, but then more than 3/4 of the population live in rural communities where they're still much more dependent on growing their own food and building, using natural building materials. So, I think that's the thing that people, sort of aren't aware of. And, positively, I would say that when I speak with people and when I'm kind of introducing them to this, they often respond in a very positive way. And they often say, wow, that's amazing. I've never thought of that. I think I often meet Australians who feel that they've been a bit underserved by their education and their media in terms of, in terms of bringing this level of understanding to them. These countries are not far away. I'm in Brisbane. Port Vila in Vanuatu is 2.5 hours away. And yet people will say they've got very little knowledge they don't know how many people live there or what the economy is based on or what their colonial history is. So, I think that's possibly the thing that's that's most prominent for me.
Well, yeah, and that's very true, and that leads straight on to the next point where despite these nations being labeled as you say, little, small, vulnerable, how do these Pacific nations assert their agency in global forums?
Well, I think it varies, and it kind of I think it largely comes down to the issue. So, and I think there's two aspects. One is it depends on the issue, and two, it also depends on the level of collective will that can be harnessed. So we've seen Pacific Island countries work together around some really important issues. So historically, we saw them work together around protecting their fisheries and making sure that fishing agreements with distant nations such as the US, the EU, and others meant that more of the revenue derived from that resource remained with the countries where the resource originates. And that was largely done by working as a collective. Similarly, the work that was done to establish the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, in which Australia played a significant part. But again, the Pacific Island countries came together to work collectively around an issue that was really important for them, especially bearing in mind the nuclear legacy in places like Marshall Islands and Kiribati, but the other countries came into support. And then I guess most recently, what we've seen is the Pacific Island countries working together around climate diplomacy and climate justice leadership. So as you'll be aware, the most recent example of that, but it's not the only one, is the work that was done that started with Pacific students studying law at USP, at the University of the South Pacific, that then persuaded the government of Vanuatu to take it on, and the government of Vanuatu then brought the other countries along to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Now, that opinion was handed down, I think, the week before last. It was, from the Pacific Island leadership's point of view, it was a huge win. They got much more out of that than they were expecting. And that is now a global statement. The plan now is to take that to the UN and use it as the basis of a UN resolution, which basically sets the scene. It's not enforceable. It doesn't have any bite to it, but it's a very strong global statement about the roles of, or the responsibilities and obligations of, nations that have large carbon emissions, what their responsibilities are to other countries that are being affected. As your viewers probably know, Pacific Island countries such as Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati are already dealing, and others are already dealing with the impacts of climate change. Vanuatu seeing bigger cyclones. We're seeing all of this drought. All of these things are already playing out in the Pacific Islands. People are being displaced. Food security is under threat. But the region as a whole is responsible for something like 0.03% of global emissions. So they're bearing the brunt of a crisis that they did not play a part in creating. What the ICJ has said is that, yes, if you dig up coal and burn it, or dig up coal and send it to other countries for them to burn it, you are responsible for the damage that's being caused elsewhere.
Yes, completely understand. Amazing point. Thank you, Doctor. So let's shift to Australia's role in the region. You've written and spoken a lot about Australia's engagement with the Pacific, and I wanted to ask you, what does Australia get right and what does it keep getting wrong?
Okay, so I think in the time that I've been kind of thinking and fretting about this, both when I lived in Vanuatu and since now I live here in Australia, I think we have seen some changes in some ways. So, for example, if you look at how the media covers the Pacific, there's definitely been a significant uptick in the amount of coverage of the Pacific in Australian mainstream media. So whereas, 10 years ago, I would have been, carrying on and jumping up and down about why hasn't this been covered? Why isn't this on the news? Why isn't this being covered in this country or that country? We now see a lot more coverage. And not just, I mean, the ABC is probably still the leader in this, but the other platforms are also coming on board and covering more stories. So the quantity has definitely improved or grown. Where I still cavil a bit and still moan and carry on is around the quality of that engagement. So what we see is that the stories that are being covered tend to be very much coloured by, quite a binary view by Australian journalists, particularly in the last few years. So they've been very much coloured by what's termed geopolitical competition. So we see a lot of stories about China's role in the Pacific. What is Australia doing to counter China's role in the Pacific? What is happening in this country that is an indication of the competition between China and the US and by proxy Australia? Which means that a whole bunch of other stories, a whole bunch of other issues that are actually much more significant for Pacific Island communities are not being reported, are not getting in front of Australian audiences. So, when I was in Vanuatu for a couple of weeks recently, and people will say to me, "Oh, did you was it all talking about China?" And I can say, "Well, I don't know that I talked about China once. We were talking about other things. We were talking about economic recovery after a major earthquake last year. We were talking about, how is this going to affect tourism, and will tourism change or will it stay the same? We were talking about, impacts of the non-communicable disease crisis in urban areas. We were talking about all sorts of things. We weren't talking about China and Australia. So I think that there's still more to do in terms of the Australian media. And I think Australian audiences need to be holding the media to account, and they need to be saying, yeah, this is interesting, but we want to know more. We want to know more about these countries that are our closest neighbours. So I think Australia has a very important role to play in the region. It is the largest provider of development assistance to the region. It is geographically proximate. There are very strong historical ties. Some of them are tied up with trauma, such as the history of blackbirding here in Queensland and in New South Wales. There is very strong cultural ties through sport, through church networks, through arts. So the kind of like all the building blocks are there. It's just about leveraging it and taking it to that next step where it's I sometimes refer to it as the Australian paradox. So it's the most important relationship in the region. It's the one that people care the most about in the region. And because they care about it, they want it to be better. So they will complain, if you like, or express disappointment at what they see as Australian high-handedness. So sometimes they'll tell me about officials that, don't behave properly, don't behave with appropriate respect. I'm still hearing, just recently, I was just with a group of Pacific media colleagues this week, and still hearing, you need to listen more. You need to be listening to us. We know what we need. We know what our priorities are. We don't need you to tell us. We need you to listen to us and then help us source the right resources for us to meet our own needs. So I think there's still work to be done by Australia and by other partners who are now seeking to be more engaged in the region than perhaps they have been previously.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because especially the media point you talked about before, because we're living in an increasingly digitized world where it's all information is on your fingertips. And it's just not the right information being pushed up to consumers. So very good point. Thank you so much. Building off that, the whole concept of the Pacific step up. Do you believe it's living up to its promise, or is it still too focused on strategic relationships, diplomatic relationships, and not real connection, real relationships?
Well, I think what's interesting is that we don't hear any reference to the Pacific step up anymore. That was very much a kind of Morrison government tagline, which is no longer used. What we do hear used much more frequently is you will hear Australian officials, including the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, refer to being part of a Pacific family, working with our Pacific family. So that use of language is quite significant. And I think it's a terminology that's used much more easily by Australian officials than by Pacific leaders. They will refer to it, but maybe not as often. You'll understand, Sid, with your background, that when you use the term family in a Pacific context, there's a lot to unpack there about who is family. The Pacific concept of family is quite different from a Western concept of family. Yeah. So, I have Ni Vanuatu friends who call me family, who will call me auntie, or who will call me sister when I'm there, because the nature of our relationship is one that comes under that term. Similarly, being family also brings with it a certain set of responsibilities and obligations. So one of the sticking points, if you like, is that Pacific people will say, well, if we're family, how come we can't come and visit without having to go through all these processes and get a visa and tell you all this information and pay this money? And, if we're family, we're my family, they just come. They don't have to go through a process to be allowed to come. So I think that there's definitely been, we've definitely seen an increased level of engagement at all levels. I think that it is, so for example, the idea that the Prime Minister might not go to the Pacific Island Forum Leaders meeting is a thing of the past, whereas previously it was not uncommon that the Prime Minister didn't go. It would now be considered very strange if the Prime Minister didn't go. We see Australian ministers in the region a lot more, which is good. So at that level, and there are other engagements, but I guess it still feels there's an element to which it's still what's the right word? A little bit engineered. It doesn't feel very organic. And I think we're still a long way from Australia and Australians being able to kind of consider themselves a Pacific country. Whereas New Zealand is a little bit more able to say, well, we're a Pacific country. Part of that is a demographic issue. There are just more Pacific Islanders living in New Zealand than there are in Australia. But there should be more Pacific Islanders living in Australia, given its history and its geographic proximity that we've talked to. So I think we've definitely seen a sustained level of engagement. I do feel that increasingly it always had that strategic imperative, and I think increasingly we're seeing that more. We've seen some recent bilateral agreements. So I'm thinking of the Falapeli Union with Tuvalu, the Nauru Treaty, and the PNG NRL agreement. Yes. That have these kind of security aspects tied into them. And, they're kind of being used as sort of a bit very transactional. Whereas in the days when I first arrived in the Pacific and was working, and we worked with the Australian aid program, which had its own agency, AusAid, which no longer exists, the development specialists there were much more concerned with building real partnerships and relationships, and not allowing aid or development to become a kind of a transactional bargaining chip. Obviously, Australia always has acted in its own interests, and it would be strange if it didn't. But what we have seen in the last 5 or 6 years is this real shift to this very transactional strategic and security driven engagement around things like development assistance.
Yep. Thank you so much. So now shifting on to the real question of climate leadership. What does true climate leadership look like? And what should Australia and the world be learning from it?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I think, again, it's one of those ones that from a distance, from like 30,000 feet, it's like, oh, yes, the Pacific thinks this about the climate. But when you get down, down on the ground, you realize that there's quite a diversity. There is an agreement, that we know that the regional leadership has made a statement that climate change is the biggest single security threat to the region. It is an existential threat. And that goes without saying. And that does create an issue for Australia as a resource dependent economy. And we know that there have been numerous occasions on which Pacific leaders have called out Australia about their lack of climate ambition. And I don't think that's going to change. This government, the Albanese government, has certainly made a significant improvement based on what we had before, but it's still a long way behind where it needs to be. Certainly, and I think that's kind of the Pacific view, but other economies, other global agencies would say the same. Within the region, we've had some real kind of standout champions. The late Tony de Brum, former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, Hilda Heine in Marshall Islands, and I guess Ralph Raganvanu in Vanuatu. One of the things that we've seen, especially if you look at Tony de Brum and Anote Tong, was that their work and their global leadership, they literally strode the global stage, had a very significant downside for them when it came to domestic politics. So they essentially lost their seats and lost their leadership at home. And a part of that was, well, this is all very well, but what about what's going on here and now? What about what we need now? Because whilst people are, they've got the climate crisis in view, they're also thinking about other things. They want to know about, their kids' education and access to health services and infrastructure. They kind of we're not just sitting here waiting for the seas to rise. We have lives to live now and families to provide for and business livelihoods to drive. So, there is that tension between being these global voices, which I think do carry a lot of weight. They carry a lot of moral weight, and they carry a lot of, now we know that they're able to, the convening power of these voices has been really clearly demonstrated with this ICJ opinion. But this is not a new thing. So previously, Barack Obama has said that if it wasn't for the work of the Pacific Caucus and the Pacific voices in Paris, the Paris Agreement would not have been finalized. So, the Pacific leadership and Pacific voices and Pacific activists, not just the political leaders, but the activists, the youth leaders, have really played a really important part. But back home, it can cause issues for them because they can be seen, so often they might face, and they've told me sometimes they face criticism that they're out of touch with what's really going on at home, or they're spending too much time overseas and they should be more focused on what's going on in their own place. So it's not always an easy ride for people that take on these roles, and they, particularly for the political leaders, they do have to manage that tension between being aware and maintaining their political support back home so that they can continue to be in positions of political leadership.
Yes, and it's interesting that you talked about this recent ICJ judgment, small grassroots movement at a university, young people getting together, becoming something massive and amazing. And that leads me to the next question. So, what role do you believe going forward do young people play? It could be in the Pacific or in Australia in shaping these stories and policies about climate change and climate leadership?
Well, I think they have. I mean, I think they're already playing a huge role, and they will continue to play a huge role. Young people in the Pacific have the advantage of being digital nomads, just like digital natives, I should say, digital natives, just like young people in Australia. So they've got the ability, even if they're not getting on aeroplanes and traveling, they've got traveling places, they've got the ability to connect with their peers across the world and to, build relationships, to caucus together, to coordinate their activism, to use new methodologies, whether it's through music or drama or poetry, to bring kind of ancient or traditional Pacific modalities into a new age and share that with a global audience. And of course, they've now got this example of what these young people who were students at USP, what they've achieved, and they can look at that and say, well, it can be done. And I hope that, someone in the media, or there might even be a documentary, something, will kind of tell that story of how that happened, all the twists and turns, and some of the quite kind of like sliding, things lining up properly, and the challenges that they had to get from a classroom in Port Vila to the International Court of Justice in The
Yeah,
Hague. That is
amazing.
quite a journey. But I think other young people can look at that and think, well, we can work together, and we can share ideas and take inspiration from each other, and to kind of not let the lines on the map be barriers, but to use other means, such as we're doing, to be able to form even bigger and stronger connections. And and not everybody's going to be a policymaker, not everybody's going to be in parliament, not everybody's going to join the public service, but I think increasingly what we'll see is that people still want to play a role. They want their voices heard. They want to see their stories in the media. They may want to be journalists that tell those stories. They want to be part of these conversations in their communities, in their countries, in their regions, and across the world.
Yeah, amazing. Absolutely amazing. Dr. Newton Cain, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Global Pulse. We're so grateful for your insight and for your work in making sure the Pacific's voice continues to be heard on its own terms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sid. Good day to you.
Thank you. So thank you for tuning in to the Global Pulse. We'll be back soon with a new guest, a new perspective, and the same commitment to meaningful dialogue. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring the challenges and solutions shaping our world. Thank you.